Hello and welcome to the Eco-vember 2023 assembly. To start off with, we're going to have a look at these two sentences. These are two sentences that you might find when you're getting stuck into a good book, and both of them have the same meaning essentially. Frankie and Anna both want the other person to go away. However, we know straight away from reading them that the context behind these two sentences is very different. Anna is clearly very angry with Robin. We don't know what Robin's done. And this is communicated very, very clearly with the author's choice of words. The language, therefore, that we use has a massive effect on how our message is interpreted. So that's what I want to focus on during this assembly, is how we can use language to better communicate ideas around climate change. And we're actually going to be thinking whether climate change is the best phrase to use. One important starting point is to consider the audience with which we're communicating. A lot of language that we use around climate change has come from the scientific community. After all, it's their research that has driven our understanding of environmental issues. However, scientists have a very specific way of writing and are often communicating their ideas to other scientists. When writing in scientific journals or presenting at conferences, they do this in a very passive way, using very passive language, and they often have to highlight the degree of uncertainty in their conclusions because that is part of the scientific method. Furthermore, many key terms they use have slightly different meanings in everyday life compared to the meaning in their scientific context. At this point, it's worth remembering that over 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are driving the current climate change. So one problem that the scientific community has faced is effectively communicating the urgency of this problem. If we have a look at the sentence on the screen, it is scientifically correct with good use of keywords. This would be a great answer if it was on an exam question. But if we want to persuade other people, including big companies and governments, to act faster, then we need to change the language that we are using. So that sentence would be great in a scientific journal, but what about if we were on stage, if we were in front of a group of people and we wanted to persuade them to act? So this second sentence is communicating exactly the same ideas as the first, but it's doing so in a much more emotive way. And that helps us to visualize the scale of the problem that we are facing. So using words like a blanket of pollution, rapidly heating, accelerating climate breakdown, extreme weather events, climate refugees, and talking about extinction, all of those are much more emotive but still correct way of communicating the same idea. The importance of the language that we are using is starting to be highlighted more and more in the world's media. Some newspapers, such as The Guardian, have taken the decision to use particular phrases as a standard in order to emphasise the urgency of climate change. And it's also important that we consider the audience that we're trying to speak to. Although people like me love delving into the intricacies around climate modelling, many people would just glaze over if I started waffling on about the albedo effect and other things. So it's vital that we understand people's priorities and what they are and what issues directly affect them in order to persuade them into taking sustainable actions. So let's have a think now about how we can modify some of the language that we use in order to help people understand the impacts of human activities. I want you to pause the assembly here and take a couple of minutes just to think about some alternative phrases that we could use. So again, I must emphasise the phrases on the left are absolutely correct. And when we're writing about climate change in science lessons, this is the terminology that we use. Okay, but let's have a look at some alternatives that we could use. So rather than global warming, using the word global heating. So that was one of the phrases that The Guardian now uses rather than warming, because warming sounds quite nice and quite pleasant, but heating just gives that sense of urgency and a sense of danger to the problem. Rather than saying climate change, because a change could be positive or negative, using words like the climate crisis or the climate emergency to understand that it's something that we have to deal with and act upon. Greenhouse gas emissions, again, that's the scientific terminology there, but that doesn't really help us understand what they are doing. So using phrases like heat trapping pollution when you're talking to friends, to family, other people who aren't necessarily into the really science side, that helps them really visualize what those gases are doing. Biodiversity loss, we could use words like wildlife collapse or ecological collapse or the ecological crisis or the ecological breakdown, are all phrases that we could use for that. And again, we all can appreciate, we can all understand the wildlife around us, so that speaks a little bit more to our personal experiences. And natural gas, this is actually a fossil fuel, and it's methane gas, because natural, that sounds good, you see it on packaging all the time. This is a natural product, and often it doesn't have a very clear definition. So natural, we think sounds good, but natural gas is actually a fossil fuel that will release carbon dioxide when it's burned, so that heat trapping gas into the atmosphere. We should also take note of the language that our leaders use to talk about these issues. Now, back in 2019, the UK Parliament took the historic step of declaring a climate change emergency. And during this debate, many MPs across the political parties were speaking in favour of that declaration, and it was passed without a vote, so it was unanimously agreed that this emergency should be declared. However, declaring an emergency is the easy part. Actually putting plans in place to tackle the matter is much more challenging. So David Attenborough spoke at that time, saying that we cannot be radical enough in our efforts to fight climate change, because it is such a problem and it's going to impact on everybody's lives. Therefore, it's important that we analyse our leaders' recent words and actions carefully. So our Prime Minister, Mr. Sunak, said recently that our net zero strategy must be proportionate and pragmatic. Now, this sounds like a very sensible stance to take, proportional, pragmatic. Let's actually have a look at what those two words mean and then apply it to the climate crisis. So proportional, this means doing something in a corresponding size or amount to something else. So if we think about this in terms of climate change, we must cut our emissions proportionally to the urgency of the problems. That means we have to cut them to net zero by 2050 in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And therefore, if we don't cut them quickly, the steps that we have to take are going to have to increase proportionally. So we're going to have to make tougher and tougher cuts the longer that we leave this untackled. The second word is pragmatic. Pragmatic means dealing with things sensibly and realistically based on their practical rather than theoretical considerations. Well, this is a practical thing that is going to affect everybody's lives. The realistic cost of not cutting our emissions and dealing with the consequences of a planet that is over 2 degrees warmer compared to pre-industrial levels. This is far greater than the cost of investing in green technologies. And this has been highlighted by the government's own independent climate change committee, and they have said that the UK is not on course to meet its net zero target with the current policies, and that's even before the recent decisions of the government to weaken their green policies. So you can see the blue dotted line on this graph shows the current path of future emissions based on our current policies. The red dotted line, that's the path that we need to take in order to reach that net zero, and we are well off track based on our current policies. And what it can be really frustrating about this is we have all seen how quickly governments and organisations around the world can decide to act during an emergency. Take the recent COVID-19 pandemic. Governments and organisations leapt into action there to protect the world. So if our UK Parliament has declared a climate emergency, why are they not acting with this in the same way, with the same urgency, to combat the climate emergency? The language that we use also has the ability to motivate and inspire people. So this is the word that I want to leave you with today. This word, opportunity. We have the opportunity to live in a world where the air that we breathe is free from polluting gases, where all of our waters are clean enough to swim in. I absolutely adore wild swimming, but we all know the problems with the sewage leaking into our rivers and into our oceans. We have the opportunity to generate our own renewable energy. We've got a great capacity for wind and solar in this country and around the world, and we've got to choose the right renewable energy for the right places around the world in order to combat the climate emergency. We've also got the opportunity to have species return to our country and improve the quality and the diversity of our wildlife. Only last month we had new baby beavers born for the second year in a row, for the first time in hundreds of years. So this is an animal that used to be in the UK, living in our rivers, living in our woods, contributing to our ecosystem. So we have the opportunity to reintroduce these animals that are no longer in our wildlife. We also have an incredible opportunity to redesign our cities and our communities to live alongside nature rather than living apart from nature. And finally, I want you to think about yourselves now. You have the opportunity, you've got a wealth of career opportunities in front of you in order to make a contribution towards a greener future. All we have to do is make sure we are seizing the opportunities that are being presented to us. Thank you very much for listening. See you next time.